the podcast mode, but the stars weren't aligned.
No, not today.
All righty. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. This is Valerie Leonard. I am the founder of Nonprofit Utopia. I want to welcome you for this surprise show. We had expected to be on the radio today, but we had something even better for you. We will be live. You will see our faces and hear us and all that good stuff. And you can feel free to post in the chat room any questions that you have at any point in time. So I just want to remind you that this is a social show and we are looking for you to chime in whenever you can, share, and make sure that you're watching with a friend. All right, thank you so much. And before we get started, I just wanted to introduce today's guest. Our guest for today is James Mueller. He is a principal of James Mueller and Associates LLC, and this is a full service firm focusing on organization management, including organizational development, nonprofit fundraising, and executive coaching for nonprofits and for-profit companies. He's located in Delray Beach, Florida, and the company provides counsel in the areas of organizational development, governance, and philanthropy for organizations in the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean. The firm's specialties include strategic planning and strategy, board development, performance, team building, philanthropy, internal and external studies, executive coaching, research, and communications. As you can see, this is truly a full service firm. Jim has a Bachelor's of Science degree in education from Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. He has a Master of Theological Studies degree from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in South Hamilton, Massachusetts. Those of us from Chicago may also remember Jim from one of his former lives. I don't want to call you a cat, but you have many lives, right?
I was rooting for him.
Right. Cat has a negative connotation, but I'm talking about in terms of the
Wildcat.
Wildcat. Oh yeah, Northwestern. Woohoo! So he has many lives. You might remember him from Goodwill Industries, or when he worked for, is it Grenzebach?
Grenzebach Clear, right?
Clear, okay. Northwestern University and Lake Forest School of Management, is it?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and Advocate Healthcare. And Jim, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. And, before we get into the discussion of your 7 principles, can you give us a little bit more information about yourself? You have a very interesting background.
Yeah, well, thank you. And that was quite a mouthful of things you already mentioned, so it's hard to add. But after you mentioned some of the places I worked at, I did work at my alma mater for about 10 years. Okay. And then Northwestern. So I spent about just shy of 20 years in higher education, about a decade in healthcare, and then a little time in social services in the nonprofit sector before going to Grenzebach Lear, which is a consulting firm based in Chicago, international philanthropy consulting firm, and then creating my own company here in Delray Beach.
And, as I listen to your career path, it all sounds like various forms of ministry, even though it's not formal ministry. It's all mission related work. And that's awesome.
Yeah. It's a privilege to work with organizations that have missions that serve people and communities. It's very, very satisfying and very rewarding. So it's been a privilege for almost 4 decades, which is scary to say, but
wow.
That's about it. So.
Oh, well, that's great. So you just wrote a new book, and it's called Onboarding Champions, the 7 recruiting principles of highly effective nonprofit boards. What made you write such a book?
I've been working with boards since I was a summer intern in 1972.
Wow.
My first exposure to the nonprofit boards. And then right after graduate school, I was again in a nonprofit, and just seeing boards from that perspective of and seeing a lot of good people wanting to do a lot of good things. And over the years, in all my different jobs, I worked with boards in some form or another. And then in the consulting practice for the last 16 years, I've done a lot of work with boards, and a lot of good people who aren't necessarily prepared to do the job they're asked to do. There's very little education and clarity about what is governance and how do you apply it for the sector's best interest. And so that was the purpose and source for writing the book.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. People have no idea what they're getting into. and I guess if they knew, they wouldn't do it, right?
There is truth to that.
There's so much riding on it. They don't realize that everything stops with the board. If there's any liability, it's on you. There's a lot, and we go into it ill-advisedly. I think so often, we have a heart to change the world and we want to do some good things, but people don't talk about what could go wrong. Or I find that many instances, and even it doesn't matter how sophisticated the people are, I find there's a commonality. People really, in many instances, have not taken the time to really be trained and really understand the legal ramifications and the lay of the land and all that stuff.
There are not a lot of resources out there. I mean, you have the Indiana School of Philanthropy, and there are a lot of graduate schools that are now doing nonprofit management, but not governance training.
Right.
And so there's a very important need to fill that gap.
Mm-hmm. And quite honestly, you need to let me stop. This is Chicago. You need to train some of our elected boards, right? I think, especially about 10, 15 years ago, people kind of misread what their responsibilities were in terms of governance. I guess you had to live here to know what we're talking about.
I was living there.
Right.
Yeah, I lived in Chicago for 22 years.
Yeah. Right. So, that's what I was getting at. It's an inside joke for those of you who are not from Chicago or never have lived here. But at any rate, I just found the book to be very, very interesting. I wish it was written when I was an executive director back in 2000, from 2000 to 2003. I had to find things out the way everybody else did by stepping in some of the biggest landmines you ever seen. But I think it was great. And what I love about your approach is, it's not steeped in legalese, and at the same time, you didn't dumb things down and just assume people didn't know. But what grabbed me was your discussion about core values versus key principles. And I'm just wondering, can you elaborate on what the differences between the two?
There are a lot of values, beliefs, and principles that guide a nonprofit. Mm-hmm. And so I make the distinction between personality values and core values. And the core values take a lot of work to define. They take some soul searching. And the best way I describe it is nonprofits are called into existence because of a need. Mm-hmm. And it's the values that you hold that compel you to do something about it. So what are those values that call you to act, right? And those are at the core of what you are. And they need to be carefully constructed. And I've just been working this last month with a national nonprofit. And this has been just working on their core values is so important for their identity, and they understand that we've spent a lot of time carefully defining what called them into existence. And it's a wonderful work for a board to do that work. What are your core values? And then there are many other beliefs and values and principles that you'll find throughout an organization that guide it in different ways. But when we're talking about core values, it's that 2 or 3 or 4 that just really say, this is our identity. And when you share them with the public, if they're well crafted, they understand who you are.
Right.
So, for instance, I'll give you one example. There's a wonderful organization here in Miami. It's the Miami Rescue Mission. They've been around for 100 years.
Wow.
Yeah. And a few years ago, we worked with them. And their values are compassion, hope, restoration, and transformation. And the idea is that they said is, without compassion, you can't give hope. Without hope, you can't transform your life. And without transforming, you can't restore it. And so by just having those values of compassion, hope, transformation, it brings you to a place of understanding exactly what that organization is.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, one of my pet peeves is working with organizations. They might say their organization's mission is XYZ. They might have this list of core values that may be ABC, but
Right.
the way they behave is like totally different. What do you do in those cases where there just seems to be a disconnect between who people say they are and who they really are, and try to right that ship?
Yeah. Sometimes it's a matter of holding up a mirror. And I had a client a few years ago, another national membership organization, very large. And during my interviews, because I always start an engagement with individual interviews with board members, and they were talking about how difficult the board meetings were because so-and-so felt put down and so-and-so didn't feel they were ever heard, and others said they were, just argue at the table. And so when I did their first session, the first thing I did was put up those comments on the screen, and the room went silent. And when they saw that reflection, they realized that their behaviors weren't aligned with what their values were. And they said, we don't need to talk more about this. We get it. And so one way is to hold the mirror up. Another way to do it is just to begin to test alignment, right? What are your programs and what are your values? Or what is your mission and what are you accomplishing in the community? Because when I talk about mission, I talk about, what have you done for whom to what impact? So every mission statement for me should know who you're doing it for and what outcome you're going to achieve by doing it for them. So it's what you do for whom to what impact. And I think that really then clearly puts you on the road to knowing where you're going once you state it like that.
Okay. And do you ever work with clients and ask them to prove they are who they say they are? What's the evidence, right?
Right. That's true. I mean, you've said it as simply, as clearly as I could. Where's the evidence, right? Could you be convicted of doing your mission?
Right. That's so hard. It's very hard.
Is there enough evidence, right?
Right.
Convict you of doing your job. So.
And there's another cliche that says character counts. And, I found that to be true in my own life. And I'm just wondering, what role does character play in the development of a highly effective board?
Yeah, I think it's critical. One great example is one of the clients that I worked for went silent for a little while, and I was wondering why. And then I read in the news that one of their key board members was being indicted on federal charges.
Oh, wow. That's a reason to be quiet.
Right. So
this wasn't in Chicago.
Right. Character counts. And I always bring up the Girl Scouts who do this very, very well.
Yeah.
That character counts for them. I served on their board for Southeast Florida, which is a huge region. And so board members lived miles and miles apart, and we would come together quarterly in a central location. But what they did when they recruited is they asked for references.
Wow.
They interviewed to say, how do you feel you can make a contribution? They met with the chair of the board, the chair of the board development committee, the CEO for a couple of different times to talk about the contributions I could make. And they did these reference checks, and they also did a background check. So they were very thorough. And the effect on me was not you're checking up on me, which I think many people are concerned about checking up on people.
Right.
They're doing due diligence. And I encourage boards to do due diligence. It works in a positive way. You want to know the character of the people on your board because, as with this one organization I mentioned, you don't want those surprises down the road.
Right.
Because board member is representative of your organization for good or for ill. So,
right. Yeah, I was very disheartening. I had a conversation with somebody and he asked me, "So what do you do for a living?" And I work with nonprofit organizations. And the first thing he said was, "Oh, they're all crooks." So that's not true. That's really not true. But he's had such a bad experience
Yes.
that, he believes that all nonprofits are that way. So I think you're right.
Yeah.
Character counts.
And I think there is a lot of trust actually overall in the nonprofit sector. If you look at some of the trust surveys, the Edelman Trust Survey looks at
Hmm.
nonprofit trust, and it's been going up. And
Hmm.
part of what they look at and part of the evidence was, who do you look to for trust? The board.
Hmm.
So the board is really held into account for the reputation of the not-for-profit. So again, we circle right back there, don't we? Character
Right.
equals trust.
Yes, yes, yes. And then, when I think of boards in terms of their competence, I'm usually thinking about skills like financial management, fundraising, and, accounting and all of that stuff. But I'm just wondering, are there other ways that board members can be more strategic when it comes to recruiting people who are competent, not just in
Absolutely.
knowing skills?
Yeah. I talk about three of the seven principles are character, competence, and connections.
Right,
Just because someone's an accountant doesn't mean they're a good accountant.
right,
They're a lawyer, a good lawyer. And
right,
it doesn't mean they want to do that when they're volunteering, right? You don't want to assume that.
right,
So when you're getting professional help, it's nice to have board members who can lend that if they're really good at it,
right.
but that's not governance. That's professional service. And
Mm,
business acumen to me falls further down. It's interviewing for the competencies you need. So what does character look like for you, and how do
mm.
you interview for it, right? What competencies, let's say sense of humor is a big one for me, that people,
Wow.
the sense of humor. Do they have deliberative skills, good judgment? And there's, are they creative? Are they intelligent? Are they risk takers?
Mhm.
What's the composition of things that you need? Are there uh, certain subject matter specialists that might help you? And then I also look at connections. The people should be connected to the community you serve. They should be connected to those that can help you advance your mission. They should be connected to philanthropy. So you should look at character, competence, and connections. Just
Mhm.
capture kind of the three areas you want to carefully investigate for your board. I recommend building a board profile. What are the things you need to excel, and what characteristics, and interview for them? It's funny that usually board members are recruited because they're at arm's length, right?
Mhm.
Rather than, and they hold the highest office in the sector. When you hire a CEO, what do you go through? Well, you have a job description. You
Right.
look for character references. You check out past history of what they've done. You ask and explore their competencies on the job, right? Why should we do less when we're recruiting board members?
That that's an excellent point. And it's interesting too that you framed competency in ways that I never thought about. Because when you look at the assessment tools, typical
Yeah.
assessment tools, you know,
Yes.
it's the hard skills, but those leadership skills and just interpersonal skills are huge.
Yes, they certainly are. And do you get along with people?
Right. Basic question.
Right.
Yeah. So what's your mix gonna be like? Yeah,
Right.
I love that. And you also wrote about a very common situation, low board engagement. People not willing to share their networks, not willing
Right.
to fundraise, and all of that good stuff. And I'm sure by the time you reach a lot of boards, they're on life support, and you have to kind of work work with them. You don't want to necessarily kick people off the board. How do you
Well,
change
you do.
it? You actually do.
Yeah. When I took over, I was asked to be chair of a board for a foundation for an art school. Um, I'm just going in, half the board never showed up for the meetings and just liked their name on the list. And I had to call some people and say, in a polite way as possible, but is this something that you really want to do? Because if you do, we need you to show up. because it's really important that every board member is fully informed and current on all the materials, because this is governance of this organization, and you need to be there. Plus, it was a foundation board, so it meant fundraising.
Wow.
Right? You weren't there for advice. You're there for fundraising. So I had to have a couple of those conversations with people. And I think it's important, but I think that's where term limits can help, because I know very few board chairs that are willing to have those conversations, right? And that's why doing your due diligence before someone comes on, because once they're in that seat, what are they there for? 2, 3, or maybe forever for some boards.
Right.
Term limits. So if you can, there are pluses and minuses to term limits that I discuss in the book, but I come out on the side of it's better to have them so that you can recruit, because through recruitment, you can really transform your board. And so you need to have that sense of movement within the terms of board members.
Right. And I can remember as an executive director, I had a board where not everybody was engaged, and it got to a point where the engagement was so low and the attendance was a problem that there are a couple times we couldn't transact business because we didn't have a quorum. So people don't realize how something as simple as not attending meetings can literally hold up very important things.
And I've seen so many bylaws that if you miss so many meetings in sequence, you're off the board, and I've seen those never enforced, right? Because people don't want to embarrass people, but still term limits come into play. And what I found, there are a couple of ways to get at this. One is I do a couple of key workshops that you can do is, what are our core values? And now it takes someone who is skilled at facilitation to get at those, and we talked about them a few minutes ago. But when you engage board members in that question, right, it starts to figure out what's your connection. And I also do storytelling workshops, and I talk about what is that 5-second moment when you found something wonderful or terrible about this organization that moved you, that caused you concern or caused you joy or caused you sadness or caused you laughter, right? Because we have those moments, and I take this from Matthew Dix. I have to give him credit. He wrote a book on storytelling. But I've used that many times, because when board members aren't attending, it's because you've lost their hearts. And you've got to recapture their hearts. Mission moments, every board meeting helps stir up the heart. But being connected to the work, if you're just connected in your head and not in your heart, you can fall away and lose that passion and interest. So when I'm talking to boards, I say you are responsible to cross the threshold of commitment. You have to own the good, the bad, and the ugly. If you're going to serve on a board, it's yours. So you need to make sure that you're willing to do that. And one of the things is, I don't mind scaring people off by the requirements, right? Because if you scare them off by the requirements, sometimes the great board members, they like it because they step up to the challenge, right? Well, this is what the responsibilities are. And so the good people will step up, and so how to separate the wheat from the chaff, as they say. So.
Yeah, and what I love about your book is not only do you give advice, but you also have assessment tools that can really help people to apply the learning immediately. You could take your book to a board meeting and get some real work done.
I sprinkled it throughout with practical exercises that you can just, in a few pages, apply. And they're pretty straightforward. They're not terribly complicated. So they're throughout each of the chapters. And that was the intent, to make it applicable. And you don't have to read the whole book. You can find the section where you're having trouble and work on that. Coming at it from a recruitment and onboarding was the lens through which I talk about really what is competence in board governance. And all the things I touch on, those principles are all about the competence and how you are a competent board member. So, yeah.
Okay, that's great. And, I'm wondering from our listening audience, if you have any questions of Jim Mueller. He is an expert in board governance. And I'm sure, if you're on a board or if you're an executive director, you have to deal with your board. I'm sure you have some issues. If you have any questions, please feel free to post, and I'll share them with Jim, and then he can answer your questions. All righty. So one thing I'm thinking about, it's pretty heavy on my heart as well as others, this whole notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes.
And it to me is not just a racial construct. I think people kind of talk about it in terms
Yeah.
of race and gender,
Mhm.
but if you go deeper, it's really much more than that. How do you go about making sure that you have a diverse board, the decisions are equitable, and everybody's included, but there's still, some sense of order? I know that's difficult.
It is extraordinarily difficult because every board has a culture. And one of the things, if you read in the first chapter, I talk about board culture, and that's where I get into core values. Boards need to understand what is the culture, and that is the unspoken rules about the way we think and act, right? That we
Right.
don't talk about, but that's how we do. And the research shows us that if we understand our core values and align with them, we manage our culture in
Mhm.
an intentional way rather than by default.
Right.
So that's the first part, is to know your culture. Also, there are also cultural differences of
Hmm.
all sorts.
Right.
People make meaning in their lives in different ways, and to some extent, and the for most boards, it's a white male paradigm.
Hmm.
And once you're there, you see the world through that lens. And the question is how can you break up that paradigm to say, well, here is implicit bias. Harvard has a great online tool for all sorts of to test all sorts of implicit bias, and I recommend that in my book to go to that site. But it opens your eyes through a few exercises to say, well, maybe I do have a bias I'm not aware of, because we bring that to every conversation. When I wrote that chapter on what I called composition, which really has to do with diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, some people call it. I sent it out to 4 Black executives and when they gave it back to me, it transformed the chapter, because I suddenly saw the world through their eyes, that I thought I was seeing it, but I
Right.
wasn't seeing it, right? And that's the tricky thing. And I think we need to come at this with a little innocence and honesty,
Right.
to look at where might our blind spots be. I was just talking to a board today, a very accomplished board of a very prominent institution, because we're talking about philanthropy and diversity,
Hmm.
and their perception that they can't be work together. And I said, absolutely, you can work it
It's
together. They're
interesting.
not mutually exclusive, right? Because if you see them as mutually exclusive, you're falling prey to tokenism.
Hmm.
Going to have this person or that person because
Right.
they look different, right?
Hmm.
Rather than the competencies that they bring. So there are a couple of other tools I mentioned in the book to work at uh, pulling out diversity, and building trust is a big piece. And also just looking starkly in the mirror at yourself, and
Hmm.
as honestly and openly as you can, and get a facilitator. There are some wonderful diversity facilitators out there that help boards understand their biases, because they are there.
Yeah. And I'm wondering too, how do you make the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion? That seems to be pretty hard.
Yeah, I had a son with disabilities, and that opened my eyes as well.
Okay. Gotcha.
He had a different range of normal.
Hmm.
You know, Stephen Hawking might be a great example of
Ah.
someone who could offer, because of his disabilities. You would say, well, what contributions could he make? And look at all of the contributions he's made. And the thing is, you look beyond the surface to the competence, right, and the character when you're looking to break through that. And it's I don't know if I answered your question there or not.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's part of it. But I find that people who work in that space have a difficult time convincing white executives that it makes sense. You know what I mean? They're looking at the bottom line. It's like,
Yeah,
so why should I care? There's one extreme that says, I don't care what color you are, I don't care about your gender. If you can perform, then fine. And then
yeah.
others, they're just more comfortable, with people
It
who are like,
comes from enculturation. Yeah, and uh, I had a call from the Silicon Valley Business Journal, and she asked me why, because the SEC rules that came out recently overlooked disabilities when they're talking about inclusion,
mm-hmm,
completely discounted them.
Wow.
And so she said, well, why? And I said, ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked about that. There's a great deal of ignorance of self-awareness in these areas without being affrontive to anyone. But it's this idea of there is so much to be gained from a different point of view. And you don't know it till you experience it. As I say to my clients when I'm coaching, you can only see from where you're standing, but someone can help you stand in another place. But you have to be willing to walk there. And so it's hard to overcome enculturation, implicit bias. It's a challenge that but I thank goodness it's in the conversation now. And I think there are possibilities.
Okay, that's great. So we got a question from Miguel Bautista. Is there a process to quote unquote recall board members?
And what is meant by recall in this case? Does that mean remove or call back to the board? That would be my.
Okay. Yeah, Miguel, are you still there? I know we can't always sit through the whole video. I don't. Oh, here. Okay. Yes, but yes. What? There were two options. So you mean firing people or making sure they come back for another term? And when I say fire, that means they haven't completed their first term. As in remove
them. Great, thanks, Miguel. I get that. So yes, I think there are agreements that you can craft with board members of understanding. Like I said, we have job descriptions for a CEO. We should have job descriptions for board members so they understand their responsibilities. And there are many reasons why someone may not be fulfilling their responsibilities. And so I always help board members have that conversation, because I think that's the first thing, is to find out why. Is there something going on right now? And the other thing is, if they're not, it's, as I said, with the board that I served on, it's that call to say, if you can't be here, we need people to be here to be well informed. And if that's not something that's going to be something you can do at this time in your life, then I'd ask you to resign from service, because we need people to be here. And so try to do it in the most understanding way, but the clarity of expectation is directly related to performance. And so that's important. And the other is just have good term limits if people aren't willing to step up, so that board members roll off. But I recommend a conversation, and they're hard conversations to have.
Yeah, and then, you brought up a point of term limits and having people rotate off. But what if there's somebody really, really good, they have to rotate off? How do you keep them in your sphere?
There are lots of ways to do that.
Okay, how do you do that?
Why we form advisory councils.
Okay.
I mean, there are so many creative ways you can do that if they're contributing really at a very high level, as long as they're not dominating. You can also invite them as guests to your board meetings, right? As non-voting members. And in that advisory council, or to be on someone that has agreed you can call on them for different questions and concerns, or they can serve on committees and not necessarily be a formal board member during that period. But usually 1 year in between terms is sufficient, and maybe sometimes they come back even more refreshed.
Okay. And then along those lines, what if you want to bring on younger people? They may not necessarily have the experience, but they've definitely got the energy. What are some of the strategies for tapping in the younger people?
Well, there's a program here in Fort Lauderdale called Emerge, and all they do is bring young professionals into the nonprofit sector. So there are programs like that around the country. But I would also say, is it token young people or young people who can make a contribution to your board, right? And if young people can make a contribution, you know what it is, tell them why you want them to be on your board, what you're hoping they will contribute, because there are a lot of wonderful, fresh, young thinkers out there, right? And it's nice to have them if you have them for a purpose, and definitely not as a token. You don't want people talking down to these young people. You want them to be really embraced. And whenever I talk about introducing new board members, I say, introduce their competencies. Tell the board why they're here, what they can contribute, and what you expect from them. And you should do that for young people as well, so that they are at the same level as every other board member and seen as that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. And also in your book, you talk about continuity, and lack of continuity doesn't necessarily mean that people have left the building. You could really have people on your board, they could be present, but there's a lack of continuity. How does that happen?
Well, I use electrical current to talk about continuity, electricity, that if you don't have continuity, you're going to have short circuits. And so what I say is the board needs to know how the organization is wired. They need to know how things fit together, how things work, how the programs operate, how the finances work, right? They need to have a full and complete understanding of the board. And I give an example in the book about this one group brought in a new chair from a high-tech company, and he was very interested in being there as a kind of a badge of honor that he is chair of this board, but he didn't understand how things worked. And a significant problem arose that was problem with a funder that may have been able to be foreseen, but was missed. And so there were some real significant funding issues in place. But because he didn't understand how that problem came about, because he didn't understand the organization, his thing was to push the board to fire the CEO and the director of development and to move on. And that's what happened. And it was sad because we had done an assessment and they were both competent. They missed something, but it also wasn't their fault that it happened, right? It was just a funder decision that was somewhat unanticipated. But if he had understood the reasons, if he'd understood more how the organization functioned and how the government grants came into the organization, he could have made a better decision for that organization.
Mm-hmm. Now, how do you work with board members, I guess, given the experiences you've had and seeing all the problems that dysfunctional boards have? How do you work with boards and get them to anticipate problems before they happen? Is that easy, or do you change the culture?
I think that's called strategic planning. Yeah. And some groups don't do it, but it's really anticipating. So when we do a strategic planning process, we really get into an environmental scan. What's going on in your world around you and how do you fit into it? What are your critical issues? Are you conscious of them? So there's this kind of deep looking at your challenges and opportunities within your organization, the cultural and community context and trends that you're facing, and then what's your value proposition that you offer and how are you going to interpret that into your programs to have an impact. But that process of looking internally and looking at your environment helps people anticipate problems down the road.
So you talk about board recruitment and you talk about onboarding. Can you share with us the difference between the two and the role that each two play, in effectiveness?
Yeah, recruitment is before yes, onboarding is after yes.
And is that for the life, or is onboarding just that first 3
I recommend a series. What the research shows and what most nonprofits do is here's the board manual and we'll do 20 minutes of orientation. People don't retain it. So in the book, I go through several training sessions. I call them educational sessions. I don't think boards need to be trained. I think they're highly educated people. You just have to give them the right information. So it's all about informing boards and equipping them to do their job over a series of sessions. Because as board members get more experienced in their environment that they're working in, they can take in more information appropriate to it. So I scale it in over the whole year. You scale in these educational sessions. So board members, and you do it in a way that first of all, you're dealing with the history in the organization and its concepts, its programs, how it functions, right? You start there, and then you move through all of the other things, including philanthropy, which I put further down the line.
Wow.
You want people to really understand the board before you ask them to start with helping with philanthropy. You want them to really understand the programs, the people, how things function, where the challenges are. And that takes a little time. And I also recommend a concept called board buddy. And that is where you get a seasoned board member pairing up with a new board member to have a conversation before the first board meeting, for instance, to say, here's what's on the agenda. Here's the history and context of the issues we're going to talk about. Do you have any questions, right? So that most board members sit like a deer staring into the headlights for the first year because they just can't take it all in. But if you have a board buddy and an educational program over the course of the year, board members are going to come up to speed more quickly, be able to contribute meaningfully sooner, and be able to have opinions on things and use their judgment because they know they have the knowledge.
You know, there's so much that you bring up in this book that's counterintuitive or so different from what I've learned. And it never occurred to me to have people engaged in all of the inner workings of the board before you go and ask them to fundraise. I mean, instinctively, I would want a rainmaker to come today, and then tomorrow he's bringing in money.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what I want people to do is be able to tell the story. That's the board member's role primarily. The research shows maybe 15% of your boards are going to be comfortable with solicitation. Now, if you have more than that do, you're a very lucky person, and great. Get as many as you can that are comfortable with that. But I want people to be knowledgeable enough to tell their own story of the organization. So it's that storytelling which is informed by deep knowledge of the organization and experience with it, right? So that it's inspired asking and inspired giving, not motivational asking, which leads to donor fatigue and solicitor fatigue when it's an obligation rather than an inspired act. And I want people to be inspired when they talk about my nonprofit.
And what are some of the key strategies you use for retention of good board members?
Meaningfully engage them. Don't make assumptions. Talk with them regularly about what they're doing, what is meaning. Ask for their advice. But it primarily something that's meaningful. And I think the CEO should be spending a good portion of time just on board development, relationship development with board members, and figuring out also what their strengths are and how they can be plugged in and how the organization can get the best from the board.
And it's interesting too, you talk about a return on values. We've all heard of return on investment, return on equity, and all that good stuff. But a return on values, I've never heard of such a thing. How does one get a return on values?
Well, this comes out of my problem with the overhead myth.
Okay.
Right. That you don't spend much on fundraising, right? You only spend so much. If you're over 15%, you're terribly out of whack. Well, it depends on what you're doing and what it costs to do what you need to do to raise money. It depends on your prospect pool, right? It depends on whether you have people in the queue or not. And the example I get is I use a backpack program, right? Where there are kids in neighborhoods that are not well nourished. And so the organization decides to have a backpack program. Well, at 15% fundraising, they're able to have weekend backpacks for half the kids. So let's say there's 400. So is 200 enough? Well, no, now you've got to hire more staff and you have to do more work to cultivate donors. Right. So your cost your fundraising goes up, right? But now you've fed 300 kids, but you still want 100 children without food on the weekends. No, so you figure out, well, we've got to invest more. We've got to take more time. We've got to make sure we raise the money. So let's say at the end of the day, it costs you 45% to feed that last 100 group of children. What's more important, the return on the value of feeding the children or the cost of doing it? There's one president of a university I talked to, he said, anything more than zero is an advantage, right? Is a return.
He's got a point there.
Right. So they're tough, difficult decisions where you invest in these areas. But the thing is that you're not looking for return on the dollars spent on fundraising. You're looking for the return on the value you deliver through your fundraising. I'm all for efficiency, don't get me wrong, but I just think the paradigm has been shaped wrong. And donors look at organizations' fundraising efficiency before they look at their impact. And we need to change that.
Okay, awesome. Now, how do you measure return on values?
Well, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
That's why we have boards.
Right.
And that's what I talk about in that book. In that lesson that I go through, I use some numbers that are contrived, but to make the point of this is what it's going to cost. What do you do now? Do you spend more to feed those children? What's the return you're looking for? And that is the board's responsibility, right? Mm-hmm. How much do we invest? But let's get focused on the service we're providing, not the bottom line of how efficient we are. So I think that is a very good question. Each board has to determine for itself what's the return on the value or our values that we invested.
And I think that's really interesting. I think a creative board could actually put together a dashboard, as they have their little financial information. They can also include the social, but that return on values, I think that would really help them stand out. I've never heard of that before reading your book.
Look, that's nice to know.
I'm telling you, your book caused me to rethink a whole lot of stuff. You know how you read things, especially when you're running an organization 20 years ago, no doubt. But I learned things a certain way, and I have a tendency to perpetuate what I learned. We all do.
Right. We all do. Yeah.
And then I'm reading this book. I'm like, that's not what I learned, but this makes sense. It really, there's a lot of aha moments all throughout that book. So
wonderful. Thank you.
I thank you for writing it. Like I said, I just wish you had the book 20 years ago when I was running an organization, didn't know what the heck I was.
I wish I did too. We all learn, right? These are lessons learned over 4 decades.
Yeah, 40 years. You write the book you wish you had.
Yeah, there you go. Absolutely. Absolutely true.
If I were starting today, what would I do different? Oh my goodness, I would do so much different.
Yeah. It's too bad we age and we learn the good stuff when we get older.
Yeah.
We don't have it when we're younger.
Yeah. If I had the energy I had then and the wisdom I learned the hard way now, I think I would be one dangerous person.
I know.
Very dangerous.
Yeah.
And then this question about collaboration, you talk about a collaborative mindset around the board, and it's interesting when I hear of people talking about collaboration as it relates to nonprofits, it's usually the nonprofit organization vis-a-vis, other organizations in the community. But you're saying that the collaborative spirit really needs to start with the board. And I'm just wondering, how do you infuse that collaborative value, and then how do you make it work?
One approach is a team charter, right, of the board, which grows out of your core values. So, what is our agreement to how we will work together and treat one another, and how will we hold each other accountable to this charter? It's that intentional culture that you create by thinking about it and articulating it or writing it down, and then holding each other accountable to that. That's one of the best ways, and I've seen it work a number of times, because we know what we want to be, and we constantly realign with that. And that collaborative mindset is being receptive and open, and not having to have your opinion hold sway, but the best point of view hold sway, right? So it's that ability to listen with as little bias as possible, and to add to. I always say, don't have a no but, have a yes and culture. Right?
I love that. I love it. All right. So those are pretty much the questions that I had. I'm wondering if folks from the audience have other questions before we shut it down. This has been really, really interesting, Jim, and I thank you. And before we go, did you have any parting thoughts, parting words? And let us know where we can find your book.
Sure. Well, it's on Amazon, Onboarding Champions, and it's in borders. It's also converted to every e-reader on the planet, so it can be found in any of those libraries. But it really is, be intentional about building the board. And this book is not only for boards, it's for executives, nonprofit executives, and also aspiring board members. I just had someone ask for it for her husband because he's serving on a board and wants to do better. And she said, I want him to read your book. And that's flattering. I appreciate that. But I think it's a book for people who want to know how to really do it well, or to at least have good questions. And if you don't agree with me, which is fine, at least you've thought about the important issues. So make it intentional, create a really sound governing board. And recruiting and onboarding are the two key aspects of getting there.
Yeah, this to me seems like a book that you would want your whole board to read and your executive staff, so that people are learning the same concepts at the same time, and everybody's learning together, rather than having a situation like, one person knows, and then once he is enlightened, everybody else seems like Neanderthals. If everybody is working.
One CEO bought it for his whole board. So we'll see how that exercise goes.
Yeah. All righty. So I want to say thank you again, Jim, and I want to thank our listening audience.
And I should show the cover of the book. So this is what it looks like if someone's looking for it. So.
Oh, yep.
So.
Great book. Okay, and Miguel again. Not necessarily just in nonprofits where many keep the same old culture. He's seen that. How difficult is it to trash the whole old system and start over? Is it difficult, time consuming? Now, that sounds like a turnaround. Are you talking about a turnaround?
I talk about that in the book. And that's another great question, Miguel. I appreciate that. Yeah, it is time consuming. And you do it over a period of combining, getting into your culture. What does it look like? What should it look like? Doing educational sessions for the board, and also through intentional recruitment according to really sound principles. It does take some time. We changed a couple of organizations completely, and it took 2 to 3 years because people would hang on to old habits. And one of the things we did was to not dismiss the old guard, but to listen to them and to say, why did you do that then? Okay, and how does that apply now? And so what I often talk about is the elasticity of imagination. You can only stretch someone's imagination so far, and you have to find out where that limitation is. How far can you bring them now? Then how far can you then bring them to the next step? So it's listening and not dismissing the old culture, but trying to translate it into what the world looks like today and how it might be different.
No, I love that. So it sounds to me like you have to really be in it for the long haul versus coming in and just automatically discarding people who don't seem to fit with the new direction and all that good stuff.
Well, and it depends from case to case. Some cases, maybe people do need to leave if they're not engaged. So, and bad behavior needs to be called out too. And the board chair needs to step up in these cases. But usually I found most people are really good people with great intentions. Most every board member that I've encountered. And so you just want to help them change their point of view through information and knowledge.
Yeah, and Miguel says he's going to get the book.
Thank you.
I guarantee you'll love the book. You'll love it. All righty, so it looks like we're done. If there are no more questions, you and I can end the conversation, but I think it was an awesome conversation. The book is awesome. I thank you so much for your time and for your patience and all of that.
Well, I'm glad we finally made it.
Yes.
And I appreciate you being so well prepared to ask really good questions. So thank you as well.
Oh, thank you. And before we go, if people wanted to get in contact with you for any reason, hopefully it's business related, and how might we get in touch with you?
My website is J Mueller, my first initial last name, J Mueller at jmuellerassociates.com. That's my email address, and www.jmuellerassociates.com is my website. So if you know my name, you can find me.
Yes, yes, yes. And thank you so much, Miguel. We really appreciate your being involved in the conversation. And I'm glad that you found this useful. That's what we try to do. We try to make sure that everything we do, there's a lesson learned that you can apply immediately. All right. So thank you so much, Jim.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Okay. You take care.
All right. Bye now.
Okay. Bye bye.